The winter of 1994 felt like an intake of breath that never fully released. In empty garages, fluorescent lights hummed and reflected off concrete like a low, private thunder. Mechanics moved through steam and solvent smells, laptops clicked, tire blankets glowed, and somewhere beyond the walls a rain squall passed over a silent circuit. Ayrton watched the new car with a stillness that looked like calm but was closer to listening. The Williams FW16, blue and white and immaculate, seemed to stare back without blinking. It should have been a sword. Somehow it felt like a riddle. Electronics that had once steadied the world were gone. The cleverness that turned chaos into numbers, active suspension, traction control, those invisible hands, was stripped away. What returned to the cockpit was not nostalgia but weight, the old physics, the sound that lives in the ribcage, the twitch in the wrists when a car shifts its soul a millimeter left. Ayrton knew that reality intimately. He had always treated speed as a living sentence rather than a statistic, something that begins with prayer and ends with proof. Now the sentence had a rough edge. The machine belonged fully to the human again, and the human had to be perfect. In São Paulo, the crowd wanted a coronation. The first race of the year always tasted like oranges and rain. He took pole and lifted the city with him, but the car, sharp on entry and vague in the middle, asked too many questions in a single corner. Deep into the race, chasing a car that did not make mistakes, he spun. The engine coughed, the stadium groaned, and that was how the year began, not with triumph but a blank page torn out. He carried his helmet a little differently back to the motorhome, as if it had grown heavier or the world had grown thinner. A week later, further across the earth, the Pacific Grand Prix opened like a trapdoor. At the start there was a jolt, a clatter of carbon, and the car was turned in the first seconds. Nothing to analyze, nothing to correct, just a violent punctuation mark at the end of a sentence that had barely started. He stood in the paddock afterward with his hands in his pockets, eyes narrowing as if he were trying to see through the fabric of the day. Nearby, freight cranes creaked, television cables ran like veins. He nodded to a child in a cap, signed a program, and disappeared into a room where the air conditioning rattled like rain on a tin roof. He was not alone in his unease. The season had a taste. It lingered. In briefings the air felt charged, as if the carpet held static. He asked engineers for geometry changes, a different steering column angle, more front grip, more trust. The data logged neat lines, the body logged the restless truth. He spoke softly, the way you speak when rehearsing a case before a higher court. Perfection, he kept repeating, is not a lap time. It is a state in which the car vanishes and you are simply moving, without translation. He slept lightly that spring. Friends heard him talk about clarity, about meaning, about the reason one races at all. He had been speaking this way for years, but the words now sounded less like philosophy and more like inventory. What to bring if the world asked you to prove why you were here? On Sundays he prayed in a way that looked like breathing, and then he drove as if the sky had lowered to touch the track. Imola came with the smell of warm grass and gasoline. This was Italy in early May, banners red as pomegranate seeds, husbands lifting children to see over fences, mothers shading their eyes. Friday exploded without warning. A young Brazilian, almost a younger version of himself, took flight and struck the limits of luck. When Ayrton reached the medics he took the boy's hand and felt the fragile weight of a pulse that still insisted on being counted. Later, in the cool of the garage, with the dusk turning the circuit the color of a bruise, he sat without speaking for a long time. The laughter that usually survives inside a team even on bad days did not survive. Someone knocked over a ratchet tray and nobody scolded anyone for it. Saturday had a brightness that felt wrong. In qualifying, a car failed to turn where it should have turned, and a newcomer from Austria died in full daylight. The paddock tightened like a fist. Faces looked older in an hour. He went quiet in that deep, private way he had, a lighthouse beam sweeping somewhere no one else could reach. People would later say he carried a small flag in his cockpit, a sign for the finish. Whether or not the cloth was there, the intention was, the reflex of one racer honoring another in the language they both understood. There was a drivers' meeting. Voices were low and tired. Safety cars, barriers, the geometry of corners no longer suited to cars that had grown too fast for the old lines, practical things and moral ones. He spoke not as the fastest man in the room but as if he were borrowing the room for a moment to hold something delicate up to the light. It was not a speech. It was a vow that what had happened could not be normal. The vow felt like the truth does when it first arrives, sharp and simple, unbearable only if you had been comfortable. Sunday morning was the quietest time on earth. The sky looked ironed. Mechanics joked with the slight over-enthusiasm of people who know jokes are needed. He strapped in and touched the wheel with the familiarity of a violinist checking the tune by feel. The formation lap rolled, and then, even before the race had gathered its rhythm, another car stalled on the grid, and then there was an impact and shrapnel, and the race was slowed to a crawl by a safety car that conserved fuel but cost heat. Temperatures fell. Tires cooled. Suspicion pooled in the seams. When the green came again, he did what he always did. He measured himself against the line between control and faith. The first lap at pace opened like a window. On the second lap at speed, the car drifted where it should not have drifted, down a left-hand curve that had punished others and spared them, and this time there was no miracle. The car went straight where it was designed to arc, glancing off the wall at a speed the body cannot comprehend except as a punctuation beyond grammar. A wheel and a piece of suspension became together a cruel, precise instrument. Within seconds the world was made only of radios and sirens, and a helicopter beating the afternoon air into something ragged. The images were carried across the planet at the speed of the century. The doctor in blue, the familiar golden-green helmet upright and then lifeless, the stretch of track turned into a chapel without an altar. In a hospital not far away, machines spoke an uneasy language, and outside the building men in team shirts stood holding their arms as if remembering they were attached to hands. For hours, hope flickered in a way hope has no right to flicker, because everyone already knew. Later, much later, the sport would argue about reasons, the column that may have cracked, the ride height, the floor, the yaw, the angle, and the physics. Regulations would be rewritten, walls moved, corners reshaped, tethers added, cockpit strengthened, crash test hardened. All of it mattered. None of it explained how silence can expand to fill an entire Sunday. What remains is not an argument but a presence. It drifts into the rain at Donington in memory, into a Monaco lap that seems to edit the laws of distance, into every onboard shot where hands move with the intent of a prayer. He understood the car the way a composer understands breath. In the wet he seemed to drive on a texture no one else could feel. He spoke afterward of something outside himself that entered when judgment was perfect and surrender complete. These are poor words for what everyone else called magic. People tried to vision when you least expect it. If safety improved because he was lost, then his absence did the work his presence had already begun. The conversations he started became structures. Chicanes appeared where speed had made arrogance a habit. Runoffs widened. Doctors were given authority not subject to theatre. Engineers learned to design with humility rather than only with ambition. Young drivers entered a world that had been softened at the edges by a grief that refused to be wasted. But reduction is a fragile kind of tribute. He was not only a cautionary tale. He was a hymn to the part of the human spirit that meets limits without flinching or lying. Watch him at Monaco in an older car and see how the chassis lines up with the curb like handwriting improving as the sentence continues. Watch him in the rain at a British circuit where the horizon is a grey blade and see how he reads the shine like a map. Watch him stroll with a child beside a motorhome and bend down to hear a question no one else had time to listen to. He was not only the fastest, he was someone who wanted to understand why speed mattered to a life. The finality of that afternoon in Italy did not end with the evening news. It moved into small places, onto posters that never came down in bedrooms, into the timing of prayers, into the way a generation paused when the first drops hit a windscreen and thought, almost involuntarily, of a yellow helmet glimpsed through spray. Mechanics kept a space in their memory where his voice gave instructions in a tone that was always polite and somehow fierce. Journalists who had sharpened their pencils on his controversies learned to write softer when rain appeared in forecasts. Rivals who had resented him found themselves defending him in late-night arguments long after midnight became morning. He had spoken often of God, not as a shield against danger or as a boast, but as the name he gave to the place where fear and purpose reconcile. People argued about this too. They wanted him to be rational on their terms. He never obeyed that request. For him the divine was not a refuge from reality, it was the most serious reality, the one that demanded you be precise and honest and reckless only with your pride. In a cockpit, that meant feeling the car's complaints down to the thread in the tire and the brace in the neck. It meant telling the truth when the truth was that the car asked for more than a man should give. It meant giving anyway and then asking the rules to be kinder, after, to someone else. There are days each year when a broadcast will replay the lap that did not finish, and the voiceover will grow grave, and the director will cut respectfully to the crowd, the marshals, the medical car, the helicopter rising with a burden it could not lighten. You can turn the volume down and still hear the noise in your chest. You can look away and still see the curve that did not curve. In certain light the track looks like a signature. In certain light it looks like a scar. And yet, when the first cloud ruptures on a Sunday and a new driver finds a line others cannot see, The world recognizes the old melody and does not call it by the wrong name. It is not luck, or bravado, or statistics finding an outlier. It is the brief alignment of faith and fact, where the car stops being an object and becomes a grammar of intention. He lived there often enough that we learned to believe the place existed. Memory is a country with its own weather. In that country he is sometimes in the garage at dawn, eyes shut, hands on the wheel, breathing the distance between heartbeat and idle. Sometimes he is in a city flat, late evening, replaying a lap in the dimness and smiling at a small mistake nobody else noticed. Sometimes he is on the grid with the sky too bright, aware of the life he has already had and the life that remains, and accepting the unfair bargain of his chosen language, that truth has a cost and that not paying it is a different kind of death. The last season did not erase the others. It gave them a frame. They stand now in sharper relief, the childhood cart that taught him about balance, the silver-black car that made his wrists ache and his soul sing, the sudden rain that made circuits into mirrors, the titles gathered like stones carried across a river, the rivalries that hurt and refined him, the interviews where he looked down as if the floor had an answer and then looked up as if he had just heard it. It all belongs to the one story. Not of a saint or a martyr, but of a man who asked a very large question and accepted that the proper way to ask it was at 300 kilometers per hour with the world pressing on either side like a tide. When he left, the sport kept going as it always does, because movement is its only law. But it moved differently. It learned to count its blessings as well as its trophies. It learned to say out loud what had been muttered, that safety is not an enemy of courage, that vulnerability is not an enemy of speed, that grief can be a form of engineering if you respect it. And every so often, when a car emerges from a corner with a kind of stillness inside the violence, as if for a second the driver is not fighting the world but singing with it, the sport remembers. It does not say his name like an incantation. It says it like a promise. On a shelf somewhere a helmet gathers dust. On a wall somewhere a photograph fades a little each year. On a track somewhere, at dawn, a marshal checks a barrier with a gloved hand and does not know he is touching the future another man purchased. On countless screens, on endless evenings, a pair of eyes the color of a deep harbor looks past the camera. The silence after the last answer still feels like an intake of breath. If you listen closely you can hear the engine turning over, the click of the belts, the brief private prayer that is not a request for victory but for meaning. Then the lights go out, and the world becomes a straight line, and for a few seconds, those holy seconds, everything is clear.